Russia just lost control of Kursk, and I do not mean temporarily. I mean strategically, operationally, and psychologically in a way that Vladimir Putin cannot simply spin away. For the first time since World War II, a Russian regional capital sits under sustained foreign military pressure, and the force applying that pressure is not retreating, it is digging in. This is not a raid. This is not a publicity stunt. This is Ukraine establishing a foothold inside Russia that Moscow has spent 6 months trying to dislodge and failing. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what we are covering today represents a fundamental shift in how this war is being fought and what Ukraine can realistically achieve on Russian soil. We are not talking about cross-border strikes or temporary incursions. We are talking about sustained territorial control deep inside the Russian Federation. I am going to show you exactly how Ukraine took Kursk, why Russia cannot take it back, and what this means for every calculation Putin has made about grinding Ukraine into submission through attrition. We will cover the tactical innovations that made this offensive possible, the strategic vulnerabilities in Russian defensive doctrine that Ukraine exploited, and the second-order effects on Russian domestic politics, military morale, and alliance credibility. By the end, you will understand why Kursk represents not just a battlefield victory, but a strategic inflection point that changes what is possible in this war. To understand why Kursk matters, you need to understand what it represented before August 2024. Kursk Oblast is not some remote border territory. It is a major industrial and agricultural center with a population of over 1 million people. The city of Kursk itself sits 90 miles from the Ukrainian border, connected by major rail lines that have funneled Russian supplies and reinforcements toward Ukraine since February 2022. This is strategic depth, the kind of territory that Russia assumed would remain untouched by a war it expected to fight entirely on Ukrainian soil. The region holds psychological significance beyond its material value. Kursk was the site of the largest tank battle in history during World War II, where Soviet forces turned the tide against Nazi Germany in 1943. That battle occupies sacred space in Russian military mythology. Losing control of the same ground to a nation Putin dismisses as artificial carries humiliation that transcends tactical setbacks. Strategically, Kursk serves as a logistics hub for Russian operations in northeastern Ukraine. Rail lines running through the oblast connect to Belgorod and onward to Russian supply depots feeding forces in Kharkiv and Luhansk. Ukrainian control of territory around Kursk disrupts those supply lines, forcing Russia to reroute logistics through longer, more vulnerable corridors. Every mile of rail line Ukraine threatens is another complication in an already strained Russian logistics network. Russia's defensive posture in border regions has always rested on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Moscow assumed Ukraine lacked the offensive capability to conduct sustained operations on Russian soil. Russian defensive lines in Kursk Oblast were designed to repel raids, not to stop a mechanized offensive supported by combined arms. The fortifications that existed were minimal, troops were second-tier, and command structures were optimized for internal security rather than conventional warfare. That miscalculation created the opening Ukraine exploited. Ukrainian forces have demonstrated throughout this war that they can innovate faster than Russian doctrine can adapt. They learned combined arms coordination that Russia still struggles to execute. They integrated NATO intelligence and precision weapons into operations that strike with accuracy Russian commanders cannot match. And critically, they identified that Russia's northern border regions were defended by troops Putin could not afford to withdraw from other fronts without creating new vulnerabilities. Ukraine's operational objectives in Kursk go beyond territorial acquisition. First, force Russia to divert combat-effective units from Donbas and southern fronts where Ukrainian positions face intense pressure. Every battalion Russia pulls from Donetsk to defend Kursk is one less unit grinding toward Ukrainian defensive lines elsewhere. Second, demonstrate to Western allies that Ukraine can conduct successful offensive operations with proper support, strengthening the case for continued military aid. Third, create tangible leverage for eventual negotiations by holding Russian territory that Putin must trade to recover. On August 6, 2024, Ukrainian forces crossed the border into Kursk Oblast in what initially appeared to be another cross-border raid. Within 48 hours, it became clear this was something far larger. Ukrainian mechanized brigades, supported by artillery and air defense systems, punched through Russian border defenses and began advancing along multiple axes. By August 10th, Ukrainian forces had penetrated up to 20 miles into Russian territory across a front stretching more than 50 miles wide. The speed of the advance shocked Russian commanders. Ukraine deployed forces that Moscow did not know had been assembled, using operational security that prevented Russian intelligence from detecting the buildup. This was not a hasty improvisation. This was a planned offensive that Ukraine had prepared for months, moving units into position without Russian detection. The tactical deception alone represents a significant intelligence failure for Moscow. Ukrainian forces employed combined arms tactics that Russian units in the region could not counter. Mechanized infantry advanced under artillery cover, while drones provided real-time reconnaissance and strike capability. Ukrainian forces targeted Russian command posts, ammunition depots, and communication nodes with precision strikes that decapitated local command structures before they could organize coherent defense. Within the first week, Ukraine had captured more Russian territory than Russia had taken in Ukraine during the entire previous year. The tactical significance of this offensive extends beyond territory captured. Ukraine demonstrated it can conduct offensive operations on Russian soil and sustain them against counterattacks. Russian forces have launched multiple attempts to dislodge Ukrainian positions, committing airborne units, naval infantry, and conscript forces scraped together from across western military districts. None of these counterattacks have succeeded in pushing Ukrainian forces back to the border. This tactical stalemate inside Russia represents a strategic nightmare for Putin. He cannot simply ignore Ukrainian forces on Russian soil. The political pressure from Russian nationalist factions demands action, but the military reality is that Russia lacks the combat-effective reserves needed to conduct a successful counteroffensive without stripping forces from other fronts. Putin faces a choice between accepting Ukrainian presence in Kursk or weakening positions in Donbas and Zaporizhzhia, where Russia has invested heavily in offensive operations. Ukraine's defensive positions in Kursk show they came prepared for sustained operations. Ukrainian forces have dug entrenchments, established supply lines running back across the border, and deployed air defense systems to protect against Russian airstrikes. They are not behaving like raiders preparing to withdraw. They are behaving like an occupying force preparing to hold ground against sustained pressure. The strategic implications of Ukrainian control in Kursk ripple across multiple dimensions of this war. First, it fundamentally alters the narrative that Russia has successfully framed about Ukrainian weakness and inevitable defeat. Moscow has spent 2 years telling its domestic audience and international partners that Ukraine is collapsing, running out of troops, and facing imminent military collapse. That narrative becomes impossible to sustain when Ukrainian forces are advancing on Russian soil while Russian counterattacks fail. Second, it creates immediate pressure on Russian logistics networks supporting operations in northeastern Ukraine. The rail lines running through Kursk Oblast that Russia has relied on for supply transport are now within range of Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes. Russia must reroute supplies through alternative corridors that add distance and time to logistics cycles. In a war where Russian offensive momentum depends on sustained artillery fire rates requiring massive ammunition expenditure, logistics disruption translates directly into reduced combat effectiveness. Third, Ukrainian presence in Kursk forces Russia to divert combat power from other fronts. By mid-September 2024, Russia had committed an estimated 30,000 troops to operations around Kursk, attempting to contain Ukrainian positions and prevent further advances. Those 30,000 troops are not available for offensives in Donetsk, where Russia has been attempting to capture cities like Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. Every battalion defending Kursk is one less battalion applying pressure elsewhere. Think about what that means for Russian strategic planning. Putin has pursued a theory of victory based on grinding attrition, assuming Russia can outlast Ukraine by accepting higher casualties and economic costs. But attrition strategies require concentration of force at decisive points. Ukrainian operations in Kursk force Russia to defend along a vastly expanded front, dispersing forces that Moscow needs concentrated to achieve breakthroughs. Russia now fights a two-front war, defending homeland territory while maintaining offensive pressure in Ukraine. Fourth, Kursk demonstrates Ukraine's ability to strike strategic depth targets that Russia assumed were beyond reach. If Ukraine can conduct sustained operations 90 miles inside Russia, no Russian logistics hub, command center, or staging area within 100 miles of Ukraine is truly secure. This forces Russia to disperse air defense, supply depots, and headquarters facilities further from the front, adding friction to military operations. The second-order effects extend into Russian domestic politics and military morale. Putin has built his political legitimacy on projecting strength and protecting Russian territory. Ukrainian forces operating freely inside Russia, while Russian counterattacks fail, undermines that legitimacy in ways that battlefield losses in Ukraine do not. Russian military bloggers, normally supportive of the war effort, have expressed fury at the command failures that allowed Ukrainian penetration. Families of Russian soldiers deployed to Kursk are questioning why their sons are dying on Russian soil to defend against an enemy Russia claimed was on the verge of collapse. This creates political pressure Putin cannot easily manage. He cannot admit that Russian military capabilities are insufficient to expel Ukrainian forces without calling into question the entire war effort. But he also cannot ignore the situation without appearing weak to domestic audiences, and international partners like China and Iran, who are watching Russian military performance closely. Putin is caught between military reality and political necessity, a position he has skillfully avoided throughout most of this war. The technological dimension of Ukraine's Kursk offensive reveals innovations that Russia has struggled to counter. Ukrainian forces have deployed next-generation drone warfare capabilities that provide persistent reconnaissance and strike capacity across the entire operational area. These are not simple quadcopter drones. These are sophisticated UAVs with extended range, encrypted communications, and precision strike capability that Ukraine has developed through iterative combat experience. Ukrainian electronic warfare capabilities demonstrated in Kursk have successfully degraded Russian communications and GPS navigation. Russian forces have struggled with command and control breakdowns resulting from Ukrainian jamming of tactical radios and disruption of satellite navigation systems. This technological edge compounds Russian tactical disadvantages, preventing coordination of counterattacks and leaving Russian units fighting blind. Ukraine has also deployed Western-supplied precision weapons in Kursk with devastating effect. HIMARS strikes have destroyed Russian ammunition depots, command posts, and troop concentrations. These strikes demonstrate that Ukraine retains substantial stockpiles of precision munitions, despite Russian claims that Western supplies are running dry. Every successful strike in Kursk proves Ukraine still has teeth, still has capability, and still has Western backing for offensive operations. Now here is where it gets genuinely complicated because holding Kursk creates problems for Ukraine as well as opportunities. First, sustaining operations on Russian soil requires logistics lines running across contested border areas. Russia has concentrated air and artillery strikes on Ukrainian supply routes, attempting to isolate forces inside Kursk. Ukraine must maintain those supply lines against sustained pressure, while also defending positions inside Russia against counterattacks. Second, Ukrainian forces committed to Kursk are not available for defensive operations elsewhere. While Ukraine has successfully forced Russia to divert troops from other fronts, Ukraine has also committed significant combat power to an offensive operation that ties down forces. If Russia achieves a breakthrough in Donetsk or Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine may face difficult choices about where to concentrate reserves. Third, there are genuine questions about Ukrainian endurance in Kursk as winter approaches. Operating in Kursk during summer is different from operating during winter when weather degrades mobility and increases logistical demands. Can Ukraine maintain its positions through winter? Does it have the supplies, rotation capacity, and defensive infrastructure needed for sustained operations in harsh conditions? Fourth, Ukrainian presence in Kursk creates escalation risks that Kyiv must carefully manage. Putin faces domestic pressure to respond forcefully to Ukrainian forces on Russian soil. That pressure could drive escalatory decisions like expanded conscription, deployment of more advanced weapon systems, or even tactical nuclear threats. Ukraine must calibrate its operations in Kursk to maximize strategic benefit while minimizing risks of Russian escalation that could fracture Western support. From Russian perspective, the Kursk operation represents a limited tactical setback rather than strategic catastrophe. Moscow can argue that Ukraine has overextended itself by committing forces to an operation far from its defensive lines. Russian military leadership has framed the Kursk incursion as a desperate Ukrainian gambit that will ultimately fail as Russian forces methodically reduce Ukrainian positions. This narrative serves domestic political needs even if military reality is more complex. Russia retains significant advantages in overall force size, artillery ammunition stockpiles, and air power. While Ukraine has achieved tactical success in Kursk, Russia can sustain the war of attrition across other fronts where Ukrainian defensive positions face relentless pressure. The question is not whether Ukraine can hold Kursk indefinitely, but whether holding it long enough creates strategic effects that justify the costs. There are also unresolved questions about Western response to Ukrainian operations on Russian soil. Some NATO countries have expressed concern about escalation risks when Ukraine uses Western-supplied weapons inside Russia. While the Biden administration has tacitly supported Ukrainian operations in Kursk, future American administrations might take different positions. Ukraine's ability to sustain operations in Kursk may depend on continued Western weapons supplies and intelligence support that could shift with changing political winds. What has fundamentally changed is the calculus around what Ukraine can achieve in this war. For 2 years, the dominant narrative suggested Ukraine could defend its territory, but lacked capacity for major offensive operations that could threaten Russian strategic interests. Kursk demolishes that narrative. Ukraine has proven it can plan and execute complex combined arms offensives, penetrate Russian defenses, and hold contested ground against counterattacks. This changes the parameters for any future negotiations. Ukraine now controls Russian territory that Putin needs to recover. That creates leverage that did not exist before August 2024. Any negotiated settlement must address not just Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory, but also Ukrainian presence in Russia. The symmetry of mutual occupation creates different dynamics than one-sided territorial seizure. The broader implications extend to how other nations assess Russian military capability. China, India, Iran, and Central Asian states have all watched Russian performance closely. Russia's inability to defend its own territory against a much smaller adversary raises fundamental questions about Russian military power that affects calculations from the South China Sea to the Caucasus. If Russia cannot prevent or reverse Ukrainian penetration of Kursk, can it credibly threaten other neighbors? Can it fulfill security commitments to allies? What we should watch for next is whether Ukraine attempts to expand its foothold in Kursk or conducts similar operations in other Russian border regions. Belgorod Oblast, directly south of Kursk, presents similar vulnerabilities. Ukraine has already conducted raids into Belgorod and has demonstrated capability to operate there. A second front inside Russia would compound Putin's strategic dilemma and force even more dispersal of Russian forces. We should also watch for signs of Russian force generation efforts aimed at building reserves capable of conducting large-scale counteroffensive in Kursk. Putin has so far avoided general mobilization that would carry high political costs. But if Ukrainian presence in Kursk persists through winter and into spring 2025, pressure for broader mobilization may become irresistible. That decision would have massive implications for Russian society and could trigger political instability Putin has carefully avoided. Finally, watch for Ukrainian operations targeting Russian logistics infrastructure in depth. If Ukraine can sustain forces in Kursk through winter, spring offensive operations could target rail lines, bridges, and supply depots that support Russian operations across northeastern Ukraine. The Kursk foothold could become a platform for deeper strikes that progressively degrade Russian logistical capacity. Russia just lost Kursk in ways that matter more than Moscow wants to admit. This is not about square kilometers on a map. This is about psychological shift in what this war means and what outcomes are possible. Ukraine has demonstrated that Russian territory is not sacrosanct, that Russian forces can be defeated on Russian soil, and that the supposed inevitability of Russian victory is a myth that cannot survive contact with battlefield reality. If this analysis helped you understand why Kursk represents a genuine strategic inflection point rather than just another tactical development, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering how Ukraine's Kursk operation affects NATO planning for long-term support, and you will not want to miss it.